The crushing weight of the ocean takes everything from you if you let it. But it was the piercing beam of a halogen light cutting through the midnight fog that finally stripped me completely bare. Before I dive into the dark depths of what exactly happened to me out here on this isolated coast, I want to ask you a quick favor. Drop a comment down below right now, letting me know what city or country you are listening from, because it always amazes me to see how far these personal confessions travel across the world. Now, let me take you to the edge of the water. My name is Vance. I am a rescue diver. I spend my days encased in thick neoprene, plunging into freezing, murky currents to pull stranded boaters out of sinking hulls, or, more often than I like to admit, recovering things that are no longer breathing. It is a job that requires you to shut down your heart. You cannot panic. You cannot feel. You just breathe the compressed air from your tank, focus on the mechanical rhythm of your fins, and ignore the terrifying void surrounding you. I live alone in a rotting wooden cabin perched on the rocky edge of Blackwood Cove. The town is small, the kind of fishing village where the smell of diesel and stale beer permanently stains the air, and where every rough-handed fisherman knows exactly how much you drank at the tavern the night before. I do not drink with them. I keep my head down, haul my gear, and retreat to my silent porch. But across the narrow stretch of black water, sitting high on the opposite cliff, is the Coastal Marine Observatory. And up there, surrounded by seismic monitors and weather radar arrays, is Rowan. I did not know his name during those first few weeks. I only knew his light. Every night at exactly 2 in the morning, the observatory runs a sweeping calibration of its high-powered searchlight. The beam cuts a massive arc across the ocean, scanning the horizon. But every single night, without fail, the blinding white beam would sweep down, glide across the black water, and stop dead on my porch. It would hold there for exactly 10 seconds. I would be sitting in my rocking chair, nursing my exhausted muscles in the pitch dark, completely swallowed by the night, and suddenly I would be bathed in an intense, warm glow. The first time it happened, I flinched, assuming it was a mechanical glitch. The second time, I thought the operator was just being careless. By the seventh night, the heavy realization settled in my chest. Someone was intentionally aiming that massive spotlight directly at me. Someone was standing in that glass tower across the cove, looking down at my isolated cabin and saying, "I see you." It made my breath hitch in my throat. I am a man who survives by remaining unseen, hiding behind my diving mask and my gruff exterior. The thought of being perceived, truly watched, terrified me. Yet part of me, a small, pathetic part that I had buried under years of freezing salt water, waited for that light every night. One Tuesday, the ocean was particularly violent. We had spent 6 agonizing hours trying to secure a flipped trawler. I swallowed half the sea, my hands were sliced open by jagged fiberglass, and my lungs burned with exhaustion. I dragged myself into the local marine supply store to buy new, heavy-duty rigging tape. The bell above the door jingled, and the smell of rubber and salt filled my nose. I walked to the back aisle, staring blankly at the shelves. When I turned around with the tape in my hand, I nearly crashed into him. He was standing there holding a clipboard. He wore a thick yellow waterproof jacket over a soft gray flannel shirt. He had wire-rimmed glasses speckled with sea salt, and messy light brown hair that looked like it had been windblown for days. He was not bulky like the fishermen. He was lean, quiet, and possessed a stillness that immediately made the chaotic noise in my head drop to a whisper. He looked at my hands, at the fresh bandages wrapping my knuckles, and then he looked right into my eyes. His gaze was exactly like that searchlight. It pinned me to the spot. "Hello," he said. His voice was steady, resonant. I blinked, my jaw tight. "Hi, I am Rowan," he said, not extending his hand, perhaps sensing that my battered hands could not take a firm shake. "I run the environmental monitoring station up on the ridge." I swallowed hard. The ridge, the observatory, the light. "Vance," I muttered, my voice sounding like gravel. "I dive." "I know," Rowan said softly. "I see your boat come in. You always cut the engine early and drift to the slipway. You like it quiet." My chest constricted. He noticed how I drove my boat. He noticed the quiet. It was such a specific, intimate detail that I felt instantly exposed. I looked away, staring at a row of brass hooks. "I do not like waking the harbor," I said defensively. Rowan took a slow breath. "And you never turn on your porch light," he added. The air between us became incredibly thick. The rhythmic dripping of a leaky pipe somewhere in the store was the only sound. I finally forced myself to meet his eyes. "I do not need a light," I said, my voice dropping lower, an instinctual defense mechanism. "I can see fine in the dark." Rowan did not back down. He just offered a very small, understanding smile. "Sometimes it is not about seeing, Vance. Sometimes it is about letting other people know where you are." I felt a sudden, irrational surge of panic. I brushed past him, tossing a crumpled bill on the counter, and walked out into the freezing wind without waiting for my change. I practically ran to my truck, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. That night, I sat on my porch, my hands trembling slightly as they gripped the wooden armrests of my chair. The clock struck 2. The beam of light swept across the ocean. But this time, it did not stop on my porch. It kept sweeping, moving past me, leaving me in complete, suffocating darkness. The disappointment that crashed over me was so violent it physically hurt. I stood up, gripping the railing, staring across the black water at the tiny glowing windows of the observatory. Why did it hurt so much? I had run away from him in the store. I had told him I wanted the dark. He gave me what I asked for, and I hated it. The next evening, a massive coastal squall rolled in. The wind howled like a dying animal, tearing shingles off the harbor roofs. The rain was horizontal, stinging like needles. I was down at the docks, fighting a losing battle to secure my dive boat. The nylon ropes were slipping through my wet, numb fingers. The waves were violently throwing the hull against the wooden pilings. The wood groaned and splintered. I cursed, trying to tie a cleat hitch, but the wind threw me off balance. Suddenly, a pair of hands reached over my shoulder, grabbing the slack of the thick, wet rope. I spun around, slipping on the slick wood. It was Rowan. He was drenched, his glasses covered in rain, his jaw set in intense concentration. "Pull on 3!" he yelled over the roaring wind. I did not argue. I gripped the rope next to his hands. 1, 2, 3. We hauled our combined weight backward. The boat swung parallel to the dock. Rowan quickly and expertly looped the rope around the iron cleat, locking it down. We stood there, chests heaving, rain plastering our hair to our foreheads. "Why are you down here?" I shouted over the storm. He wiped water from his eyes, looking directly at me despite the chaos. I saw you struggling from the tower. I could not just watch. We hurried up the slippery wooden stairs and walked to my cabin. I unlocked the door, and we practically fell inside, slamming the heavy door shut against the howling storm. The sudden silence in the cabin was deafening. The only sound was the drumming of rain on the tin roof and our harsh, ragged breathing. My cabin is not a place for guests. It is cramped, filled with smelling neoprene wetsuits hung over chairs, oxygen tanks stacked in the corner, and a small, rusted wood stove. Rowan stood near the entrance, water pooling at his feet, looking around quietly. "Take your jacket off," I said awkwardly, my voice hoarse. "I will make coffee." He carefully peeled off the yellow waterproof jacket, hanging it on a hook. Underneath, his flannel shirt was damp, clinging to his shoulders. I turned my back to him, focusing intensely on the small propane stove. I filled the metal kettle, struck a match, and lit the burner. The blue flame hissed to life. I reached into the cupboard, my torn hands protesting, and grabbed a bag of coffee beans. I poured them into the manual grinder. The harsh, crunching sound of the beans filled the room. I ground the coffee with far more force than necessary, trying to burn off the terrifying nervous energy coursing through my veins. "Are your hands okay?" Rowan asked. His voice was close. He had moved from the door to the small kitchen counter. I stopped grinding. I did not turn around. "They're fine." I heard him shift his weight. "You ran away from me yesterday," he said softly. I gripped the handle of the grinder. "I did not run. I just had to get back to work." Rowan was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his words were deliberate and slow. "I did not stop the light tonight because you told me you did not need it. But standing up there in the dark, watching the water, I felt terrible. Because I realized I was not doing it to bother you. I was doing it because your porch looked so incredibly lonely, and I wanted to sit with you, even from far away." I closed my eyes. The walls of my carefully constructed isolation were cracking, splitting open under the weight of his quiet honesty. I poured the hot water over the coffee grounds. The bitter, earthy smell filled the damp air. I poured 2 mugs and finally turned around. He was standing right there, leaning against the counter. I handed him a mug. Our fingers brushed. His skin was freezing, but the touch sent a shock wave straight up my arm. I retreated to the other side of the narrow kitchen. "I am lonely," I said, the words falling out of my mouth before I could stop them. The admission felt like pulling a tooth. "But I do not know how to be anything else. My job is death and cold water. People do not want to be around that." Rowan took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving mine. "I study the deep ocean, Vance. I know everything about the cold and the dark. It does not scare me." We stood in my kitchen for over an hour while the storm raged outside. We did not talk about anything grand or dramatic. He told me about the migration patterns of whales, how they sing to each other across hundreds of miles of empty ocean, just to confirm they are not alone. I told him about the silence of the deep wrecks, how time stops moving when you are 70 feet under. We just talked, real, continuous talking without the fear of judgment. But the real world does not let you hide in a warm cabin forever. 2 days later, the sky cleared and the harbor woke up. I was dragging a cart of empty oxygen tanks toward the compressor station when Old Man Higgins, the harbor master, stepped in front of me. He had a cigar clamped in his teeth and a suspicious glint in his watery eyes. "Morning, Vance," Higgins grunted, looking past me toward the parking lot where Rowan's blue Jeep was often parked. "See you had some help tying off during the blow the other night, the weather boy from the ridge." I felt a cold spike of dread in my stomach. The harbor was a ruthless place. Any deviation from the rough, solitary masculine norm was immediately weaponized into gossip or exclusion. Yeah, he happened to be walking by. I lied smoothly, my heart racing. Higgins chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Walking by in a hurricane. Right. Just watch yourself, Vance. People around here, they talk. They see a guy like you getting too cozy with the guy who watches the birds and the waves. They start wondering if you've gone soft. And a soft diver gets people killed. He spat on the concrete and walked away. I stood perfectly still, my knuckles turning white around the handle of the metal cart. The panic was immediate and blinding. It was the same panic I felt when a diving airline got snagged on a wreck, the instinct to cut the line and swim to the surface, to survive. I avoided Rowan for an entire week. I went to the grocery store one town over. I drove to the docks at dawn before anyone was awake. And at night, I stayed inside, sitting on my sagging mattress in the dark, staring at the walls. Every night at 2 a.m., the bright white beam of light swept across the cove. It hit my empty porch, lingered for 10 excruciating seconds, and then moved on. He was looking for me, and I was hiding. By Friday, the guilt and the longing became a physical ache in my chest. I could not sleep. I could not eat. I was treating him like he was something shameful just because I was terrified of what a bunch of miserable fishermen thought of me. I realized that keeping myself safe from their judgment meant condemning myself to a lifetime of sitting in a dark, empty room. I grabbed my keys, threw open my front door, and drove my battered truck around the winding coastal road up the steep cliff toward the observatory. The tires spun on the loose gravel as I pulled into the small parking area. The observatory was a tall, cylindrical concrete building with a glass dome at the top. I walked up the metal exterior stairs, my boots clanging loudly against the grating. I reached the heavy steel door and pounded on it with my fist. A minute later, the door creaked open. Rowan stood there in his socks and sweatpants, holding a mug of tea. He looked surprised, and then his expression softened into something incredibly sad. "Vance," he said quietly. I stood in the freezing wind, my chest heaving as if I had just run 5 miles. I stepped inside, shutting the heavy door behind me, cutting off the sound of the wind. We were in the main observation deck. Panels of blinking lights, monitors showing wave graphs, and a massive circular desk filled the room. The large glass windows overlooked the vast black ocean, and far below, a tiny dark speck was my cabin. "I am sorry," I said, my voice trembling. The words felt huge in my mouth. "I am a coward. I let an old man with a cigar scare me into hiding in my house. I was terrified that if people knew I wanted to be around you, they would look at me differently. They would strip away the only identity I have." Rowan set his mug down on a console. He did not look angry. He looked entirely calm, which somehow made me feel worse. "You do not have to apologize for being afraid, Vance. You have built a fortress to survive. You cannot just tear it down in a day." I walked closer to him. The warm, humming machinery of the room vibrated through the floorboards. "But I hate the fortress," I confessed, staring intently at his face, mapping the small lines around his eyes. "I hate it. I sat in my dark room for 7 days, and all I could think about was the storm, the kitchen, and your freezing hands. I do not want to hide anymore." Rowan took a step toward me. The space between us vanished. He looked up at me, his eyes searching mine, looking for hesitation. "Are you sure? Because out here, in this town, it will not be easy. They will stare. They will talk." I swallowed the lump in my throat. Let them talk. I spend my whole life pulling people out of the dark. I want to pull myself out now. Rowan reached out, his hand slowly rising to touch my face. His fingers traced the rough line of my jaw, avoiding the healing cuts. The gentleness of the gesture completely broke me open. I closed my eyes, leaning my heavy head into his palm. A shaky breath escaped my lips. I opened my eyes, and he was right there. I reached out, my thick, calloused hands resting tentatively on his waist, feeling the warmth of his body through his clothes. I pulled him slightly closer. He tilted his head up, and I leaned down. The kiss was hesitant at first, a clumsy collision of two people who had forgotten how to be touched. But then his hands slid up into my short hair, and I pulled him firmly against my chest, gripping him tightly, as if the ocean current was trying to rip him away from me. It was not a movie scene. It was desperate, breathless, and filled with the terrifying relief of finally letting go. When we eventually pulled apart, we rested our foreheads together, both of us breathing heavily in the quiet hum of the control room. We stood there for a long time, just holding each other while the radar screens blinked around us. The next morning, the sun broke through the coastal fog, casting a brilliant, blinding light over the harbor. I drove my truck down to the docks. I did not park in the back. I parked right in front of the main slipway. I got out and I walked around to the passenger side. I opened the door and Rowan stepped out. He was wearing his yellow jacket. I was wearing my heavy wool sweater. We did not hold hands. We are not people who need to perform for an audience, but we walked shoulder to shoulder, our arms brushing with every step. We walked straight down the main wooden pier toward my dive boat. I saw Old Man Higgins standing near the bait tanks. He stopped talking mid-sentence. Two other fishermen turned their heads, their eyes wide, staring openly at us. The silence on the dock was absolute. I felt the familiar spike of panic flare up in my chest, the urge to step away, to create distance. But then Rowan's shoulder bumped firmly against mine, a silent anchor. I kept my head high, looking straight ahead, and we walked right past them. I unclipped the ropes, Rowan hopped onto the deck of my boat, and I started the engine. As we steered out of the harbor, cutting through the bright morning water, I looked back at the receding docks. For the first time in my life, I did not feel like I was fleeing. I felt like I had finally arrived. This life forces you to make a terrifying choice. You can stay in the dark where it is safe, where nobody can see your flaws, your fears, or your true self. Or you can stand in the blinding light, expose your bare heart to the world, and risk everything for a chance to finally breathe. I chose the light, and looking at Rowan standing on the bow of my boat, the wind in his hair, I know I will never go back into the dark again. So, to everyone listening to this confession right now, I have to ask you a question. Have you ever hidden a part of who you truly are just to make the people around you feel more comfortable? How much of yourself are you keeping in the dark? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. Share your own stories. And if this resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button for more real, raw stories.